Welcome to the data session. My name is Tom Vander. I'm from Getting Smart, an education advocacy group. We have an amazing panel with us today. Jose Ferreira is from Knewton, an adaptive learning company that's working both in K-12 and in higher ed. Janet Barresi, the chief in Oklahoma, and Aimee Guidera, who runs the data quality campaign. What I'd like to do is sort of split our conversation into two parts. In the first portion of our conversation, to talk about the benefits of data, particularly in regards to personalized learning, but more broadly, in honor of Clay Christensen's presence here, I want to talk about what jobs does data do for us in education, or what job should data do for us in education. And so I want to give you a chance to think about that, because I'd like to start with some interaction around what should data do for students, teachers, and schools. I'll ask each one of you to answer that as well. And then we'll shift and spend the second half of our time talking about privacy protections for kids and for families. Some of the emerging issues there in regards to specifically to state data systems and also the data products and services that schools are using. So that's the rough split, sort of the benefits of data and then some of the emerging issues around the use of data. So let's start with the benefits of data. What job do we want data to do for our kids and for our schools? Anybody want to start? Mick, what should data do for kids and teachers?
I have a big belief in the idea that data should inform instruction for teachers to help them personalize the learning of students.
How many teachers are you working with?
Over 100,000.
So Mick works with Mastery Connect. So they have 100,000 teachers that are sharing assessment items on their platform. So one answer is it should inform the work teachers are doing. Giselle, what should data do for kids and teachers?
Well, for kids, it should help them follow their plan, their learning plan, and give them feedback on a constant basis so they know exactly where they are. Great. And for teachers, it should empower them to help the kids alongside whatever they need to fill in as these pieces of information become available. And in the long run, all of the data should be able to give us guidance as to how to treat every learning style and every kid's needs.
That's a great answer. So underscore your opening comment of it should be part of every student's learning plan and be constantly, it should be constant feedback in terms of how they're doing, right? Good. Other things data should do for kids, teachers, schools? Randy, I know you think a lot about this. What's on your list?
Probably further down on the list is the accountability piece. So it should give us insight into how we're doing in that personalized learning and educating every child.
Okay. So accountability, and to be specific, it would be the state's responsibility to make sure that every family has access to good schools. So it's school quality, but it's also authorizer. Important for authorizers so that they're authorizing and renewing only high quality providers. Good. Anything else that we've missed? Yes, there's a mic right there. I think you could jump up and give us a headline. What job should data do for kids in schools?
Well, you missed a constituency. It's kids, teachers, and the parents.
Great.
The parents, when you get down to it, it's not only accountability, it's actionable information, even down to the point of Johnny's late with his science homework.
Right.
So that there's the delay in getting that information to the parents so something can happen,
Right.
which means it has to be current and immediate, et cetera, also has to be taken into consideration.
Great, thanks. That's a great addition. Actually, I just posted a blog yesterday on how these guys at Mastery Connect are sort of reinventing the report card and giving parents and teachers and kids really good information, like down to the sub-skill level on how they're doing. So thank you. Anything else that we missed on what data should do for kids, teachers, schools? Yes, sir.
I think data should allow us to target interventions on the fragile learners, target the right people, the right interventions, the right resources, and I think data can do.
Good, thanks. That's a terrific addition. So it should give us a sense of priority of where to spend our time and resources and to very specifically target interventions. Jose, that feels like a really good place for you to give us a recap of how data can help personalize learning.
Sure. So there we go. Oh wow, that's loud. Okay. Hi, I'm Jose from Knewton. So what we think data can do is pretty profound, because students produce more data than just about any other consumer application. So way more data per user per day come out of learning than come out of online search or any other big data system. Students just bleed data. They always have. And those data have always basically been lost. Now, the classroom itself is not a particularly data-rich environment, but that varies from teacher to teacher. If you're just lecturing, the students don't produce much data. But materials, going home and interacting with materials, can be intensely data-rich, but it's hard to unlock the data. Now, if you unlock the data, here's what you can do. You can figure out things like, very quickly, within days or weeks, here are these students' proficiencies, if you're a teacher. Here are my students' proficiencies at every concept in the course. And all the concepts they've seen, you can measure that within a few points of accuracy, a few percentile. And you can start estimating the concepts they haven't seen yet, based on correlations with the concepts they have seen. You can estimate how strong they're going to be. You can figure out things like, this student is going to struggle next Thursday. There is no universe where this student isn't going to struggle next Thursday, because next Thursday introduces concepts that build on concepts we know for a fact this student is weak at. Now, in the traditional education model today, student gets to Thursday, in some way level fails, because they don't achieve sufficient proficiency on Thursday's concepts, and then all the concepts that subsequently built on Thursday's concepts that the student learns down the line, every single one of those is sub-optimized, because the student sub-optimized proficiency next Thursday. They sub-optimized proficiency next Thursday because they were allowed to fail because the data were invisible. Nobody knew that the student was going to struggle on Thursday. But we can know it now. We can, rather than let the student get to Thursday and fail, and then hope the student fixes it herself, which is kind of the current system, or maybe someone will figure it out, maybe there'll be a tutor, maybe. Rather than do that, we can not even let the student fail and then fix it. We can actually prevent the student from failing altogether. If we just bundle in a little bit more time for homework to pre-remediate, to get the concepts up and the prior concepts, we can make sure that that student is ready to absorb all of next Thursday's concepts. That's just one thing you can do. You can do things that seem like magic. You can do things like, this student learns analytical, quantitative things better in the morning. For whatever reason, it could be genetic, it could be chemical, it could be she drinks coffee, who knows, it doesn't matter. If it's true, and it may not be true of many students, but if it's true of you, we'll know it. If you learn something best with a cocktail of text and video and practice questions, for whatever reason, no one knows exactly how the brain works. Maybe there's a brain chemistry reason why you just learn this thing best this particular way. Or maybe it's simply because if you learn something, if you just get the exact same media format for everything you learn, after a while it becomes boring to you. Just like you can't imagine reading a novel where every single sentence was subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object. That would become redundant and boring. Right? If that's true of you, we'll know it. Whatever the right blend of media is for a particular thing, we'll know it. If you learn science best in 14-minute bite sizes, at the 15-minute mark, your click rate always declines. Your time on task always increases. You get bored of science at 15 minutes. If that's true of you, we'll know it. There's basically nothing about you, about what you know and how you learn best, that we won't know. Because that's how much data you produce.
So what you're describing is sort of within a walled garden, that in addition to the achievement data that's spinning out, there's other forms of data about the learner experience that together with the achievement data can tell us how a particular learner would learn best, right? So I would call that a sort of a learner profile.
That's exactly what it is.
Good. Aimee's going to tell us about state data systems, but before we do that, Dr. Barresi, what would you add just in terms of data, and how is it important to you and other education leaders in your state to have good data on students?
I'd agree there's a great deal of data out there, but our interest is turning that into information for teachers first and foremost. But with that goes the awesome responsibility of protecting that student's privacy. And that is what prompted the work that we went through in Oklahoma, of recognizing the incredible, powerful potential for teachers and for educators to help children, but then to also realize our responsibility to really protect that child's privacy.
And you've made some real progress there. So we'll come back and talk about that. Aimee, you've been working on improving data quality for more than a decade. Tell us about your effort to help states improve their data systems and why that's important.
Sure. So I'm an unabashed believer in the power of data to basically transform education. And everything that we've been talking about for the last 2 days in this meeting, the slices of this apple, when you go down the line of what we all believe sitting in these rooms, none of this can happen unless we change the conversation and the culture around data use in this country. It has the potential to equalize conversations, it has the potential to inform conversations, it has the potential to empower every single stakeholder. And when you step back and look at it, in fact, I brought some things in your packets, that kind of answer the questions. And you all said so eloquently in the beginning about the power of data. And to summarize what you all just said, when you think about it, when we launched the campaign, the Data Quality Campaign, which is an advocacy organization about changing this conversation about the use of data, we launched it specifically talking with policymakers, because we had to help them understand what is a state longitudinal data system and why is it important, not just for data collection, but as the superintendent said, the purpose of collecting data and having data is not so you can say we've got data sitting in a state warehouse. It's so that we can use it to inform discussions, to inform our actions more importantly, and most importantly to ensure that we're changing what we're doing based on what that data tells us, and most importantly that we get to changing those outcomes. And I think that's so important when we're talking about data. It's data for what? It's data to improve student achievement. And if we ever forget what we're doing that on, that's when we get into the trouble that the superintendent just referenced of thinking about we're creating big databases in the sky and that there are concerns. So let me be really clear. I think there are 3 really specific purposes of data that we all need to focus on. One, for policymakers, how do we make sure we discover what works in education to get every kid to achieve to a high level? We won't know this unless we have longitudinal data that's able to follow individual kids and figure out what works and at what price. We can't afford to keep throwing time, money, and energy at everything and doing this by anecdote, doing it by hunch. We need to know what works, at what price, and where we're getting the biggest returns, and how do we personalize it for kids, which leads to the second point. We must make sure that educators get that timely, actionable information to make sure that we're not educating cohorts of kids, but that we're making sure that we're educating individual kids, because that's what we're about. It's no longer good enough to talk about groups and cohorts. It has to be about individual kids. And because of the investments that we've now made in state longitudinal data systems, we can now personalize learning and tailor learning and make sure that every kid succeeds. And lastly, I want to reference the point that the gentleman over here brought up about parents. We have never given parents the information that they need to be strong partners and advocates for their kids. This is the game changer. We now have the ability to give every parent, every family, every student in this country information in a timely way that makes sure that their kid is on track for success, making sure that they're making choices in a way that they have full information that they've never had before. To me, this is probably the most powerful part of it, is that we're now empowering parents as informed partners in their kids' education, and that changes everything. So anyway, thanks. But I think that's the important piece, and I think we need to make sure we realize we can't afford not to use data well, because if we don't change how we use data, we will never reach our goal of having every American child graduate from high school and graduate ready for the knowledge economy.
Aimee, look, I want to ask all of you, I'll give you a chance to respond to this question. When Jose described what's possible, in terms of in a learning loop with a learner and a teacher, maybe a learner and a teacher and a parent. How do you think about the data extract that goes from that intimate learning experience, and what should go to the school level, the district level, the state level? How do you think about that? He described several orders of magnitude of keystrokes more than was possible 10 years ago when you started the data quality campaign. So how much of that information does a state leader like Dr. Barresi need?
And you should probably answer this first if you want to. Okay. So, I mean, that's the big issue, is that there's so much data out there. And what we need to figure out is who needs to see what data in what format at what point. And the bottom line is the vast majority of data that that's being collected and that's being shared at the state level does not need, especially at let me start first. Federal level, to be really clear, there is no collection of personally identifiable information. The federal government does not need to know how your kid did on the math test last week. What we need to make sure is that we have that aggregate level information that we can do big studies and things like that. At a state level, it's again very limited collection of data, but it's important that it's longitudinal data able to follow individual kids over time, because we need that information at the state level to ensure, one, that we're providing access to every parent in the state, to every teacher, as the superintendent said, because most districts are low capacity, low resourced, and don't have the capacity to make sure that they're building the data analysis and the tools. But also, the state is able to provide the critical feedback loops that cannot happen at the district level, being able to report back to high schools of what happened to your kids. What do we know? Why is it that when you gave them A's in math, that a half of your kids graduating need to take remedial math at the university down the street? Things like that. But the really important piece is that so many of all the data points that Jose just talked about, that stays at the classroom. It stays at the school level. It needs to be communicated to parents and to teachers and to students themselves. But that, I think, Tom, the really important piece is that we have not been clear with the American people about which data is being collected for which purpose and who gets to see it. And we need to assure the American people, and especially parents, that data is being kept secure and safe, and that we are limiting what's being collected to what we actually need, and and how it goes up the line.
We'll circle back to that in just a few minutes, but anything you want to add to, like, how much of that data do you want access to? What form do you want it in?
You know, I tell everyone at the State Department, I said, everybody says we believe that every child can learn. And I said, our job is to make sure that each child learns. And so what we look at is a way that we can assist districts and assist classroom teachers and educators in allowing each child to reach their potential.
Right.
So what we do at the department is we kind of pull the lens back a little bit and take a look at the aggregate data. And so we assist districts in kind of providing them the information and really the training on how to slice that data and how to look at their children without us needing to look at the individual information.
Right.
We teach them how to work within that room without us needing to see the individual data. And then we as a department bring the lens back and we look at it as a whole. And I'll give you a real specific instance. We are very involved in the work in reading in our state and in helping third graders being able to read at third grade and move on to fourth grade. We started looking at our state data. And approximately, if you look at our cohort of kindergartners up until third grade, you're going to see that at the beginning of the year, about 36% of those children fail their first assessment.
Right.
But by the end of the year, somewhere in the average of about 13% of those kids are failing. So there's improvement through the year. But as that cohort moves through the grades, you get back to the beginning of the next year, and you're back in the mid to high 30s of those kids failing that test. And we looked at each other and we said, what's going on here? That's not summer slide. There's something more to it. And so that allowed us to get very granular and to help districts begin to understand that. And we found that what was not going on is, first of all, teachers were teaching to the test and getting kids through the test at the end of the year. But what was not going on is real skill development was not happening. That caused us at the department to respond to it, to completely shift the way we support districts and support teachers in reading instruction, and assisting them with their reading programs. So it allows us to help each other.
Okay. I'm going to ask Robin Bagley to describe a data success story in progress in the state of Utah. A year ago, they adopted a data backpack bill that will ensure that teachers have the chance to personalize learning from day one. Why don't you describe the intent of that bill?
So Tom was out visiting. We had him come out for a digital learning conference, and they'd just written a paper for DLN, the Student Data Backpack. And he said, we really need to get a state to try to do this. And I said, we'll do it, because we're suckers. We'll try anything. So anyway, we've done other things that they've brought out. So we moved forward and put together legislation, the Student Achievement Backpack. And we in Utah are fortunate because we have a very robust longitudinal data system already in place that we'd spent over $21 million on. So it was already set up. The problem is everything's in silos, and it's not available down to the fingertips of teachers, administrators, and parents. And at Parents for Choice in Education, we're about individualizing education and empowering parents. So we set together to create something that would bring all of this data together and then push it down into our student information systems, which isn't going to be very complicated at all because we already have this great system set up. So we actually worked with the current provider of our system, our Utrex data collection system, Pearson, and we mapped out how this could be done and how it could be done for about $250,000, and then we moved forward with the legislation and passed it. It'll happen in 3 phases. The first phase is to take everything up into a cloud-based record store, and that's where it will be collected, so that when you have your SIS system at your district, you're already inputting data, you're cleansing it and sending it up to the state and recording it. And in our state, prior to this legislation, all districts were required to be SIF compliant so that their school interoperability framework was going to have to be aligned to the system anyway. So that was another thing we'd already had knocked out before we even had to go forward with this legislation. So phase 1 will create the cloud-based collection store, and then phase 2 will expand the amount of data they're collecting to make sure that we've got a full learner profile showing these kids how are they doing on their assessments, what's their attendance, what are the keys and things that we can learn from collecting this data about what their individual student needs are. And then finally in phase 3 in 2017, all of this data will have to be pushed down into the student information systems. Now, this is a place where parents already go to get basic information. By the time this is completed, they'll be able to get this complete learner profile. Up here, they talked about number of clicks. Today, the number of clicks in our system, just to get to school-wide data, is 16 clicks, and that's only if you know what you're doing. So it was time to eliminate the silos, use the technology we have, and push everything down to empower those who are in charge of our students' education.
So the net result will be a compact grade book that'll move grade to grade and school to school if a student moves, so that a teacher will very easily, with a set of permissions, be able to learn about the kids that are in his or her. So it's a full transcript available with permissions on day one. That doesn't sound like much, but most schools don't have access to that simple kind of data on the kids that enroll in their school. Anything you want to add, color commentary about that? Things you like, things you're worried about?
I just think it's great. I mean, I think what Utah's doing, a lot of states are going to follow, and there are lots of models. So Georgia also has created what they're calling a tunnel system, where that the state's data is now showing up, popping up on a teacher's desktop or laptop every day, and trying to do the same thing. But what's so unique about the Utah experience is that the families really own the data. And I think this is this conversation we need to have, right, is that in all parts of our life, it's who owns the data, who's a steward of the data, and how are we really clear about who has access to what. And Utah has taken that conversation and changed it entirely. So kudos.
Janet?
It's not only about stewardship, it's about constant inventorying and review of what is important and what's not important, and the quick willingness to eliminate those elements that are not important anymore to help the child.
Before we go to data privacy, which is obviously extremely important that we have as a conversation nationally as well as in this room, I don't think people really recognize or can totally process how much data is coming. Because right now in education systems across the United States, if you're getting in the ones of data per user per day, you're doing great, right? That's less than what Google and Facebook get, but that's what school systems that are collecting data at all, that's what they're getting. Google and Facebook get in the tens of data per user per day, which is a lot. But students can produce, if we tag content, there's only so much you can do in the classroom itself. You've got to tag content, and then you've got to do a lot of psychometric work on top of that content and database architecture and statistical work. But you can start cascading out data exponentially. And students are going to be producing millions, maybe billions of actionable data per day, right? So 6 orders of magnitude more data than any school system in the country gets right now. That's what's coming. And what you can do with that amount of data seems like magic. You can basically tell at any given time, here's exactly what the student knows, and here's how she learns it best. And when they go home, within the first hour of the first day of interacting with a next-gen textbook that'll be delivered on an iPad or something, it will be a unique experience for that student. There'll be no 2 students in the country who have the same experience. And you can take the combined data pool, you can anonymize it, and you can find the perfect strategy for every student. So 30 millionth student in a textbook wants to learn rules of exponents. You go overnight, you query the entire database of all 30 million kids. You find who, that's anonymized, but who is just like this student in terms of the way that they learn and what they knew at the time they had to learn rules of exponents was really similar. And then you say, well, statistically speaking, it has to be the case that some top 1% of those people who are just like her, through pure blind luck, did the perfect thing for themselves to learn rules of exponents and they didn't even know it. But we can know it, and we can for that concept and for every other of the 1,000 or so concepts she'll learn in that course, and for every course she ever takes, we can use the combined data power of a network of tens or maybe hundreds of millions of people and use it to find the perfect strategy for each child, for each concept they ever learn. That's what's coming.
Let's shift gears now and talk about, with that sort of potential, that the order of magnitude of data that we're talking about and that kind of potential, let's shift gears and just talk about privacy. There's this emerging, with the explosion of apps, we sometimes forget that iPads only came out in 2010, like April of 2010, and there's probably 80,000 learning apps that are available just for the iPad. About half of the ones that are sold to preschool parents. So they've been very active consumers. And a note was issued by our friends at Common Sense Media this week about some concerns about data privacy emerging from particularly the consumer learning apps being used in, for the most part, preschool age kids. Is that a new area of concern for any of you? And as schools begin to encourage kids to bring their own device to school, are we starting to see that privacy issue being brought into school? So is this primarily a consumer issue, or is it something that we need to start thinking about for schools? Jose, we talked a little bit about this at the break.
Sure, I can get started. I mean, everyone's got a strong opinion about this. And the for-profit internet and IT industry have developed a bad name about this and have trained the country. As a society, we're gun-shy about these issues because they are ad-based models. And ad-based models set up a structural conflict between the user and the company. The company only makes money if they sell your privacy. That's how Google and Facebook make money. And if that model would be horrific if it were applied to education. It's not being applied to education very much. There are some app makers that maybe, look, if you're a parent and you go home and you buy an app on a store, you're giving the app maker the right? So that's you may decide that was a mistake and take back that permission later, but you have done that explicitly. Companies like mine, we're partnering with Houghton Mifflin. We've got a pilot that's going to be in California in January, and we'll roll out in the fall. And there's no selling of anything. Every single piece of data we collect is used just for recommendations, and that's true of just about every
So that's very different.
I know.
I think that's an important point, that you're working in a walled garden, right? Called a formal learning setting, and it's quite different than most of the issues addressed by that letter this week.
Exactly.
Janet or Aimee, do you want to add anything specifically on that?
I think the distinction first is that parent that gives the child the iPad that begins to interact with the apps. That's the parent giving the permission, inherently giving the permission for the child to interact, and therefore then indirectly the company is getting the information.
But this is clearly a signal that it is time for parents to pay more attention to the apps their kids are using, right?
Exactly. And perhaps a good byproduct of the work that we're doing is to inform parents of the power of that information for them, good or bad, but the power that can bring to them.
Right. Aimee?
I'll just add one other thing. I mean, protecting students' information and their personally identifiable information is everyone's responsibility, and we have to prioritize it at every single point in the conversation. I mean, as Americans, we're learning this. It's on the front page of the paper every day right now that we're having a conversation in our culture about data and data on us and what the government should see, what companies should see, what gets sold and what gets not. And this gets even ratcheted higher when we're talking about children, and that's what we're talking about here, our kids, and how do we make sure that we protect it? So there's a whole conversation about outside of the school and what parents do, which Common Sense Media is bringing up, but there's also a conversation that needs to happen when the government is involved, because there's a level of trust that we need to build in the public, and we need to assure them. And the point I want to make right now is that it is against the law for the government, for any of these agencies, for the superintendent here, for your local superintendent, for any teacher to sell any data or to share with anyone your child's data. It's just against the law. We have federal law on this, we have state laws, we have local laws. It is just against the law, and it's not happening. And if it does happen, that business goes out of business. They get forbid from doing business with the school or with the government. But this is where we need to help parents understand and build trust in that as well.
Thanks. Dr. Barresi, your state has recently taken really constructive action in this regard. Would you share that story with us?
Sure, and it's interesting that last night Michael Graves spoke about some of the chiefs that traveled to England and walked into those academies, and I was one of those chiefs that walked into those academies. I walk in the front door of one of the academies, and the absolute very first thing I see inside the front door is a listing of every child in the building by their name, and posted next to their name is the series of test scores that they had received during that year in the various subjects. Not only that, but they were color-coded by zones of achievement. And those children that were the top achievers wore their color code badge on their uniform, and they wore it with pride. And I thought the perspective on that was very interesting. And I asked a child that was wearing one, and I said, "Tell me about how this makes you feel." And well, of course, I'm very, very proud to wear this. I said, "I'm going to ask you something kind of maybe uncomfortable. What do you think about those kids that aren't wearing a badge?" And the boy next to him that didn't have a badge on, and he said, "I can't wait till the next time I take a test to get that badge." So kind of an interesting perspective. And then fast forward to right now to where we are in this country, because we believe an individual's right to privacy is one of our most fundamental rights that we have in this country. And so with that, it came to the work of two of our state representatives, our co-authors, Representative David Broombaugh and Representative Jason Nelson, decided that we are getting a great deal of data.
Are they here with you today?
I don't think they're here in the room.
All right. I just wanted to
with us
acknowledge them if they were.
Want to recognize their work, though, and we have a copy of the state law with you all, I think, as well as our state policy that we have around it, and refer you to that. And welcome any kind of comments about it, and we're constantly looking for ways that we can improve it. But it is with the idea that an enormous amount of data is coming down to us. Who owns it? How are we going to interact with it? And how are we going to use it to the benefit of each child in the state? And so the analogy that I give you is that we did build a fence around the data, but we didn't build a concrete wall. We didn't build a stockade fence. We built a chain link fence around the data. And so that keeps the data inside, and it allows us to see each other in the work we're doing. It allows those that are on the outside to see us. It's the transparency of the work we're doing, because the real way you build trust in this is to create that transparency. So no one's really wondering what you're doing with the data. and then allows us then to interact with those that want the data and to go through a decision tree, if you will, and a decision process to make sure that the data is used responsibly and used well, but still allow us to complete the really necessary and lawful functions and the moral functions that we have within our department to make sure that money is distributed to districts appropriately, make sure we're interacting with parents and educators appropriately with the data, to make sure that we have very clear guidelines as we interact with various vendors through our contracts. We interact with other state agencies through our agreements that we write with them in creating those covenants that we're going to operate under. It is very specific guidelines, but it allows us a comfort level of as we look at this, at governing the use of that.
Robin mentioned a data backpack paper that we wrote, and in that paper we described a learner profile, and we described kind of a multi-provider world that we're moving towards, where many kids during the day will interact with a number of different education providers. So that might be taking an online course, that might be dropping into an adaptive software product during the day, and then it may be going to a Sylvan tutor after the day. Do any of you have thoughts on how, when, if a learner profile should be made available, or how a parent could make it available to, let's say, a Sylvan tutor, and whether they should just have read access or read-write access? Any thoughts on after-school providers or summer providers and how they might fit into this new world? Did your bill contemplate any of that?
Let's talk about that child that'll go to Sylvan.
Okay.
First of all, that's initiated by the parent.
Right.
And the parent's interacting with the school district. The parent has every right to go to the school district and receive the information and make sure that that information then goes to Sylvan. That allows for that, no problem.
So it's a parent choice.
Parent choice. And so the district then is the center of the source of the information for the parent.
Do you see a time in this sort of competency-based future where a student can go to a provider, kid that learns algebra that way, and brings back some form of proof that they've learned it, that the school would accept? Do you see that happening? You'll worry about it when we get there?
Sure.
Maybe the state has an end of course exam
Sure.
where the kid can demonstrate competence. But.
Sure, yeah, and those are some things in the future that we're going to be exploring in Oklahoma as competency-based education. And again, this gives us a foundation to move forward with that as well.
Aimee, anything you want to add on this multi-provider?
So I'd love to start. So one of the things that's so important is that we have done something amazing in this country in the last 10 years. Every single state in this country has built its data infrastructure. And that's what Robin brought up, that they were able to have the student backpack, data backpack happen in Utah, because Utah, like the other states, had built up their capacity to be able to collect and store and analyze longitudinal data. That changes everything. It makes all of these conversations that Tom is leading us on about how do we transform this into actionable information, how do we then open the world to lots of wonderful providers like Jose to think about how do we meet need. But the important piece in this conversation is that data is not for data's sake, that data systems should not be built by data people. The data systems need to be built and refined and constantly updated and changed to answer those priority questions of the end stakeholders. And if we ever forget that, our data systems get off track. We need to go back and say, what is it that parents need and want? What is it that educators need and want? What do governors need? What do legislators need? And we only need to collect the data that can answer those questions. So it's limiting it, but then this question is going to be a great one. How do we make sure we make it easier for parents to do their job to ensure that all of the different learning opportunities are being captured and the mastery and competencies are actually captured, and that how do we create a seamless world of education?
Right.
We have the potential and the capacity to do that. Utah's going to show us how we start getting there. But the bottom line is we've got to not let data people create those data systems in the sky that get scary to people, because that's what scares people. It's like all this data sitting in a cloud somewhere. We need to always focus on for what purpose, why, how are we protecting it, and making sure that the end users are driving this data conversation, not the technologist.
And the data quality campaign, what's your URL?
It's dataqualitycampaign.org, and all of the material, and we have
so you built a great framework for that. It sounds like what's the bill that you passed?
It is the Oklahoma Student Data Accessibility, Transparency, and Accountability Act, SDATA. And we call it 1989, House Bill 1989.
So those are the two really good frameworks for the use of data. We have about a half hour left. I'd love to open it up to you. Would love questions, short, with a question mark on the end. Corey, do you have one? Go.
Thanks. So it's for Janet. So pardon if I was the only one that missed this, but when you gave that example of your trip to the UK and the public listing of the data identified or mapping to the students, and then started talking about privacy, was your point that that was the wrong approach in the UK, and that should be masked? And if so, can you talk about the philosophical perspective behind hiding that data?
Well, it felt like there's two issues, right? One is that you could see the kids' names as soon as you walked in the door, and the other was the sort of leaderboard approach, right? And you want to add another editorial comment? Did it make you nervous to find the kids' names, right?
No, not at all. I just thought it was just an incredibly interesting contrast between the way they operated and motivated their children, and are looking at doing this to protect the privacy of students in the United States. Argue for their effectiveness and their worth, but it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
It was less the fact that kids' names were listed and more the sort of leaderboard was kind of in your face.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the second part of that is the philosophical approach to masking it. So the second part of it is you're talking about the privacy of the student. By not listing that data, by us protecting that and siloing it, what do we gain? How does that impact education from your perspective? Why have you guys gone that route?
I really think in this day of time, it really was a bit of an archaic approach. And I think in this day and time, it allows us to continue to support the future and the future success of the child, to begin to grow the child. I believe that every child has potential, no matter what their backgrounds, no matter their past experiences. And I think it is very important to protect their future and their future potential.
Right here. Will be.
My question's, it's on now, is also for Janet. We work with about 50 districts in your state, specializing in teacher evaluation software. And I was down with Carrie White and Jennifer Gleason a couple weeks ago discussing the quantitative data that the state's trying to collect. My question is, how do we serve as a intermediary between the state and the districts that we serve to communicate what the state is trying to do to make it as effective as possible?
Great. So you're a state data partner. What would you like him saying and not saying?
Well, first of all, we have a very clear contract with them that stipulates the data that they're collecting and how they're using it, and penalties for any abuse of that we take very, very seriously. And in our state, we are working very hard to help teachers to use data to inform instruction, and to also not see it in terms of their accountability, to not see it as a scary thing, but see it as a really important tool in how they can continue to improve their practice. I think the Oklahoma academic standards that we're working towards in the state, I really think our teacher and leader effectiveness system is one of the most important conduits to help us achieve that. And so that is portraying this as the tool that teachers can use to continually improve their practice.
Great. Thanks. Right here. And then
Morning. Good morning, Adam Geary, Florida Chamber of Commerce. So we love this idea. And one of the things we're running into in the Florida legislature is Democratic members who believe we are data mining our students, and then super conservative right Republicans who believe the exact same. And so we'll be in a committee hearing, a bill will come forward, and you'll have people on both sides of the aisle who equally hate it, but who all agree that we need this. Talk about some of the ways that we can work through that, and what are some of the challenges that you might have saw when you were working through your bill?
I think clearly transparency is absolutely clear. Transparency in how you develop the policy, and transparency in actually how you operate within that realm of privacy. As my director of student information says, John Craman, he's in here in the room. John, where are you? Raise your hand. He says, how can you prove what you're not doing? And so what we do by transparency is show everyone how we are operating and the decisions that go on, and the bill, I believe, clearly lays that out. And I think that is important. So that lays that groundwork of transparency, that you can begin to get agreement. And then also agreeing on the policy itself. What are we trying to do with this? Who are we ultimately serving? We're serving the children of the state. That is the most important thing that we serve. And we quickly found very common ground on that area. The idea is the child is the most important, their privacy is the most important thing, and then from that, how do we build out and create a system that allows us to support them to truly reach their potential?
So I love how it's like our last speaker, how you start with purpose and you're really clear about that. That's going to be so important because things are so dynamic right now. Learning opportunities are improving every quarter. I mean, what the world that Jose described is rapidly evolving. So we need to, this has to be a dynamic conversation. I mean, you've put a really good frame in place, but you'll probably have to make adjustments 2 years from now, right, based on actual tools and practices.
And Tom,
Randy, did you have one? Follow up to that? All right, I'll come right back to you, Randy.
Gary Stanislawski, I'm in the Senate. Yeah, and what the superintendent said is correct, but in the Senate and in the House, because you asked how did we get it passed. How we got it passed was that bill was not put forth as a means to gather student data and do great things with it was put forth as a restriction on what the uses of the data can be used for and who can get it. So yes, that's how it got passed. It was restricting the use of that data, and therefore we had agreement from everybody.
That's a really good addition. And it does go back to the question that we discussed earlier, is how do you need an active conversation about the data extracts that happen from the teacher-student interaction and up, and who needs what data for what purpose. You want to
Can I just jump in on that for a sec? I think what's really noteworthy about the Oklahoma experience, and I commend to everybody looking at the bill, Oklahoma is leading the nation on this, and also look at the ALEC model legislation that is also, you can find online, that is a phenomenal, based on the Oklahoma bill, based on lots of other good bills around the country as a model. But a couple things that are really important on this point of how do you get people to come together. The first piece is this needs to be a public, open conversation, and that's the legislative process. Rather than having this happen in some basement in an agency somewhere, which is how we don't build trust, is when people think that something's happening with a bunch of bureaucrats. I love bureaucrats, but people don't trust things that bureaucrats do in basements. And to date, that's a lot of what's happened with data, is that all of a sudden there's a black box, something happens with data, no one knows what's happening, and people are like, that doesn't feel really great. What Oklahoma did is they made a very transparent process of saying, let's have a conversation. That's how democracy works. Let's have a conversation about this. Let's make sure that we have hearings, that people can voice their concerns, that we deal with the legitimate concerns, and we make sure that everyone's clear about what's happening. That changes the discussion. People don't think things are happening in basements anymore. They know they've had a voice. But then to this other question, what's really important is we don't just focus on the privacy piece, which I get it. It is really, really important. We can't afford not to focus on safeguarding this data, but we also cannot afford not to maximize and leverage the use of this data, because we're not going to reach our goals unless we focus on it. And the way to go with that and to build the value proposition is to go to the what's in it for me. You need to help parents understand why they as parents need this information, why as educators they need this information, why a chief needs this information. And we can't forget we need to reinforce that, and we need to balance the need to use this information and the need to protect it.
I live in Colorado, and they're with InBloom, and it has created a huge controversy over, number one, the issue of a private corporation owning or having access to all this data. They did a very poor job of explaining how some of that data was going to be used. So parents were saying, why do you need to collect this? And then finally, it just turned out that they were in fact collecting some data that this district promised was not going to be collected. So two questions really. How do private systems like Knewton or teacher evaluation systems or any of the other private or interact with state data systems, both to share data and make sure that the privacy restrictions are all adhered to? And second, how do you rebuild trust when you've blown it like that?
Thank you. Who'd like to start on that? Jose, do you want to take a crack?
Sure. I'm not a big expert in Bloom, but from my perspective, they did three things wrong. One, there was no great value proposition that they were clearly explaining to anybody. No one really knew what the value of InBloom was, right? That's one. Two, they held a lot of PII, personally identifiable information, right? So Knewton doesn't hold it. We just pass it through algorithmically, but we never hold it. And so people get really nervous when you hold personally identifiable information. And you know, I think if you're going to hold people's data, you've got to really, really clearly explain it to them. You've got to make sure that they have bought in. And one of the things that we have a problem with societally, and this is why our muscle memory reflexively makes us want to, you know, wonder if these are going to happen in education, is people push boundaries. Because for years, we're all used to, we've been trained by Google and Facebook and other consumer web platforms that sell our data because that's their business model. We've been trained by them to constantly expect them to push the envelope, and all of a sudden, oops, I didn't really give you permission to do that. You claimed permission, but I never gave it to you. And that felt a little bit like what happened within Bloom, where it's like no one really gave them, the parents didn't give them permission to do that. And you cannot arrogate unto yourself permissions that people didn't give you when it comes to their kids' data or their own data. That's just crazy. You can't do that. You've got to get explicit permission. It's got to be really clear what the benefit is.
Aimee or Janet, you want to comment?
First of all, the information has to be aggregate and it has to be de-identified. Those are the two most important thresholds that have to go through. It has to be by someone that is an educator, identified as an educator, and or someone who is authorized within the department to work with that. If it's within a district, it is incumbent upon those districts to impose those same guidelines on a vendor. And it's done through a very clear, very concise contract and agreement that also has penalties for violation of that.
Thanks.
It's all done ahead of time.
I'm wondering, Aimee, to the second question of after a district or a state screws up and it's obvious that there had been inappropriate data use or collection, thoughts on Randy's question of how do you earn the trust back?
Again, the word we keep saying is transparency and clarifying and getting people to understand why. Why are we doing this? What's being collected? And giving people full information. I mean, that's how we feel good about, we mentally, I mean, we know what's going on, and also in your heart you feel like it's safeguarded better. So I think the question is, we can't do enough communication, we can't do enough providing transparency, and this is what's been missing in all parts of our conversation about data, is that people really aren't sure what's going on at Google and Apple, and when it's our kids, we want to know more what's happening and how do we make sure that we're protecting our kids. But I think I just need to underscore, though, that in Bloom is representative of a lot of things that went wrong, but there are thousands of organizations and companies and nonprofits out there that are trying to figure out how do they now personalize learning. I mean, this whole conference has been about how do we personalize learning? How do we make sure it's not good enough for kids to just get along, go along? And that's what we've been doing. We have not met our goals because we have not personalized learning for every kid and met them where they are. That's the awesome news. We now can do that. And there are some really smart organizations, companies. The free enterprise system, as we were just inspired to think about this morning, is ready to help our kids succeed. Right. And they need to have access to information and probably identifiable information to be able to make that work for your kids. And the issue is, how do we do that and unleash the power of data at the same time building the trust in that community, in your community, that says this information is going to help my kid, which is what we all want, but also I feel confident that this information will not be misused, it will not be sold, it will not be used inappropriately, and it won't harm me. Because people will not use data or let other people use data if they think it's going to be used to come back and hurt them. And it's not an either or, we have to do both.
Thanks for underscoring the opportunity set.
Yeah, it's huge.
That's super important. We'll come back to you, Giselle. We have one right here.
When we first started talking about the idea of data-driven decision-making, so back in the 90s, the idea with models like accelerated schools, for example, the idea was that we were going to empower teachers by having this data that they could then address instructional strategy. And we seem now, here we are, 25 years later, we're sort of getting to that point where we can do that. Along comes Jose, and it sounds like what Jose is saying, you know what? I can do a lot of that. I can do a lot of that, what we're previously thinking that the teacher would be doing, exercising professional discretion, that thinks maybe that's something the algorithms can do. And I'm wondering, the implications of that for teaching. On the one hand, I'm not entirely sure myself that the teaching force as a whole is, completely up to the requirements of taking that data and applying it. On the other hand, I'm not personally terribly comfortable with handing it to an algorithm. And I'm curious as to how you folks think about that.
So I've got a great data point on that. So what we found, there's a phenomenal, anyone here from Oregon? Yay, Oregon. So Oregon has what we think of the data quality campaign as one of the best models of building educator capacity in what we call data literacy, understanding how to access and use data in the learning process. It's something called the Oregon Data Project. It's on our website if you want a great story on it, because it's a great story. And what they found is that they did a lot of research ahead of time on the impact of teachers having access and knowing how to use data in the classroom. And what they found, they did research about where they were and then what happened after teachers got training on how to access and use data effectively. They found that student achievement went up in those places that teachers were trained, but where the greatest impact on learning happened for kids is when the teachers' perceptions of the value of the data changed the most. And when you think about it, it's that teachers look at things like this data thing is one more thing I have to do, it gets imposed on them, and unless they understand in their heart and soul the value of this, it's just another thing that's clogging up what they need to get to. But what we're finding is when teachers actually get it and they understand that this data is not a hammer, it's a flashlight, that it's the most powerful tool in their arsenal, we're seeing impact on student learning and we're seeing really big gains. And that's, to me, the message of we can't tell people just louder and louder, use data, and just keep pounding it into them. People have got to come there and we've got to start training our teachers and our parents and our media and our government officials about what it means to truly not just access it and use it in a compliance way, but to truly transform learning.
Thanks. Jose?
Thanks. I think when I said that Google and Facebook get in the tens of data per user per day, that's what they get. A typical Google search, about 10 data points. And Knewton, for our most active users right now, gets in the millions of actionable data per user per day. So I think I can say that we get really extraordinary quantities of data. So I think I have special expertise when I say that there's a limit to it, and I know what those limits are. And the limits are we can teach very commodity things very well with an algorithm. We can probably teach them better than a human being in some respects because we can diagnose the kid algorithmically. We know if the kid doesn't understand multiplication tables as well as they should. We can almost read their mind about that. But does a teacher really want to just be training out multiplication tables in the classroom? That's not a good use of anybody's time. We can do the stuff, the boring stuff, the dirty work, the basic concepts and facts and skills. We can do that stuff better than has ever been able to have been done before. We can diagnose it, we can remediate it, we can do it in real time. We can take the combined power of the entire network of hundreds of millions of kids to find the perfect way for a kid just like this. That's great, and those are the limits. If there isn't a right answer, if there's a gray area, if there's ambiguity, if there's higher order critical thinking skills, if it's about building a love of learning or imagination, we can't do any of that. And no data is ever going to change that. Teachers aren't going anywhere. This is just about getting kids better ready for class.
Thanks. Jenna?
I actually think all that is doing is building an incredibly powerful tool. I think it is fundamentally changing the profession of teaching. And it is further empowering teachers to have yet one more tool to fully personalize learning and to help kids reach their potential. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And it's just one more very important evolving of the system to really reach children and unlock their potential.
I just wanted to put a plug in for the Blended Learning Implementation Guide. Came out last week. Looks like that. It's something that every school and district leader should take a look at. It's available on Digital Learning Now, It's also on a thumb drive that we have outside as a free ebook with a set of 7 policy papers that go with it. The reason I wanted to mention that quickly is part of the answer to Mark's question is we'll only make good use of it is if we create school models and cultures and relationships for teachers where they can really benefit from that kind of information, where they have structures that allow them to buy some time from the technology. Here's a really quick story of School of One, a picture that I like to share with folks. It's a picture of 50 kids in a room. 40 of them are online, 10 of them are in a small group around a table with a teacher. And the magic thing about that picture of 10 kids at a table with a teacher is an algorithm recommended that those 10 kids spend an hour with that teacher on that lesson. So think about the gift for a teacher to be able to teach a small group of students that have demonstrated readiness for that lesson on that day in that modality. You know, that's really the power of predictive algorithms and dynamic scheduling that Jose's talked about. So to create the opportunity for a teacher to be able to teach in that kind of setting where they actually have a chance to make extraordinary gains, and then, as everybody has said, to work on the more critical things that only teachers can do, that machines are never going to do. I think that's the gift. And those things are going to happen when schools and districts make conscious choices about how they use the tools in these new blended school models. Giselle.
So I'm going to ask a stupid question, which really comes to I'm getting this, you know, and I don't understand, so I'm honestly asking the question. What is it that people fear about what gets out about a kid's information? I don't understand that. I can understand that if your health information goes out, you know, employers can know, and there are things that are, but what a child does, how he did on, you know, on a math test at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, what possible threat is there in any of the information? I don't understand what kind of information people think is obtainable from this model that is a threat to the children. I don't get it.
What's all the fuss? Janet?
Not a dumb question, but an incredibly controversial question. And it is simply this, is that with the fear that Aimee talks about that is out there, is that the gathering of information then by some unknown out there, and many believe that it's the government or some sort of unknown agency, will have enough information to gain a level of control to influence the course of someone's life. And it is, we always talk about, we're teaching children how to think, not what to think. And I think the greatest fear is from a parent is that this will lead, if we do not protect the privacy of students and the data that is produced and the way data is used, that eventually children will be engineered in a way to think a certain way and to operate and to act in the world another way.
Okay. Aimee, anything you want to add?
So I think it's a very important question, and one of the pieces that we put a link into is our Mythbusters piece. And I think just looking at it, what we took were the pieces that are, there's so many legitimate concerns out there in the world right now, and we're having that conversation here. But there's also a lot of myths and misinformation out there, and there's fear mongering. And so one of the things we did at DQC is we went through and we identified all the things that we were hearing in social media and were being picked up that were just not right. But it also gave a window into what people were fearful of. They're fearful of the federal government having access on their kids. They're fearful of things being part of a kid's permanent record that can hurt them. I mean, in this country, we believe in opportunity and giving people a second chance. That's what America's about. That's what we talked about this morning. And people are fearful of, well, what is part of my kid's record? What can stick there? Right. And the other bottom line is, people, to this point, we have not empowered individuals with their own information, and they haven't seen the value of it yet. So to a parent, why are you collecting this? I haven't gotten any value out of this yet. And so in a society where we haven't empowered the person most, the student and the parent who needs this information and the teacher, to say, and we're collecting all this, it raises fears of, well, why are you collecting this if I'm not getting value out of it? So I think it's the lack of clarity that's caused concerns of, I don't know what's going on, so something bad must be happening. And it's also this fear, as the superintendent said, of again, this legitimate concern about people having access to my kids' information that they don't need to, whether it be a government or whether it be a private corporation. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at the Data Quality Campaign is clarify exactly who has access to what, while at the same time helping people realize that as an educator, as a legislator, as a parent, especially as a student, you can't do your jobs unless you have access to quality data, and we need to protect it.
Good. Thanks. Stephen Bowen, until 4 weeks ago, was the chief in Maine.
Bureaucrat in Maine. I know we've been talking about privacy because that's the concern that everybody's got, and we're hearing a lot about it at the state level. But I'm finding myself sitting here and reflecting on Clay Christensen's observation from this morning about the gap between this pace of technological change and our ability to make use of it. And I guess my concern is, even if we solve the privacy issues, if our educators and our school leaders are not able to do this customized piece that we know needs to happen and be able to use this data to do what we've been talking about, I think we could still lose this thing. I mean, we've built these huge data systems. Aimee's team was a huge help to us in Maine. We've got all this data. How are we going to train hundreds of thousands of educators, school leaders? How are we going to train parents, now that you've got all this data, to actually do something with it? Because if we don't, I think we could still lose this thing.
So how do we train teachers? Thoughts on that?
We are deep into that work, very deep into that work. And Steve, you're exactly right. I was struck by it too today. How do we fill in that gap between turning data into information for teachers and information to parents? And it's not easy. It's a process, and it is ongoing. We can't achieve it overnight.
Michael Fullen, in his book Stratosphere, said that we as education leaders have to make technology elegantly simple, right? So that there is an onus on those of us that are investing and deploying technology to try to make this a tool set much better for parents and teachers, right? So we have work to do.
So one thing, it's a great question. So I think, one, there's some policy answers, but one, this is a cultural issue. One thing I wish I had a copy to give you all, but if you go on the line, we actually just put out a piece called A Year in Mrs. Buford's Data-Rich Classroom. And it's literally an infographic showing how data changes the conversation with a teacher, a student, a parent, and how it's used.
Great.
And we're doing that as part of an effort that we have at the DQC that's broad-based with partners about talking about data literacy, including how do you define data literacy? And how do you actually define...
Have you published that infographic?
Yes, it's on our website. It's actually on our homepage right now if you look on it.
And tweet it, so you'll find it on the EI.
I've actually used it, and it's a great communication tool with parents.
But one more data point. So
Go
thank you for
fast.
that. One more data point is only 11 states at this point in this country require some kind of data training or literacy to get licensure to be a teacher. Well, right there, that's a policy that we can all change and say, wait a second, this is a skill set that every educator in this country needs to have, and yet only 11 states have found it necessary. CCCO has a great effort going on right now to change that conversation, and people should watch those 20 states. They're going to change it.
All right, 30 seconds.
So I think short nuggets of obvious value add to various stakeholders. Now, most personalization is going to happen with materials because you can personalize materials down to the sentence. It's hard to personalize a classroom because you got all those kids in there. But what you can do is give parents clear alerts like, hey, your daughter's better at math than she thinks she is. We can actually tell that algorithmically. I can explain why after. Or if you're a science teacher, you're a biology teacher, and you've got a kid who seems really bright but is struggling, we can tell you things like, you know what, this kid is actually top in the class for biology concepts. He's struggling because English is a second language. We can tell you that.
I have an interesting question on, we talk a lot about parents' control and teachers' control of the data. What role do students have in control of their own data as minors? And yeah.
Thank you. Students, where are they in the equation? I mean, what kind of ownership, what does that mean?
Well, in terms of having control over it, once they're 18, they're the ones that have control over it.
And what about before that? What about when they're in this beautiful walled garden kicking out all this data? Do they have any responsibility?
That's a sort of a societal decision. We just, you know, so it's it's right now the school says, you know, we're gonna be a custodian of, and the parent is a custodian, and we have to play within those boundaries.
So I'm not going to take it as a legal one. I'm going to take what an opportunity. What we're starting to see is research showing that when we tell kids, this is where you are, and if you want to go, Governor Bush, you want to be a veterinarian, this is what you need to do, and we start giving kids real information about where they are and not lying to them. We empower them with doing the right thing and giving them the supports, and without that,
it shows them
done.
career paths.
So the ownership of their own learning,
it's huge
opportunity,
Huge.
right? But the second thing is just we, as parents and educators, we have to teach digital literacy. Right? That's very important. It's never been more important for parents to monitor what their kids are doing. So I'm going to end on that. Would you join me in thanking our great panel?